Well, this year is the 20th anniversary of my website, HP Calculator Archive, or hpcalc.org. And I thought a good way to celebrate would be to give first a history of how calculator applications were obtained on the internet prior to the existence of my website, and then a little bit of the history of the creation of my website, and finally the work I've been doing over the last year or so to add a whole lot of content to it. So first, the early days of the internet, time of the HP 28 and 48. I'm sorry for those of you who are more used to the 41, but I'm focusing on the RPL and later machines with my site. So around 1989 or so, there was a news group, comp.sys.handhelds, and it was the source for discussion of all handheld products. But it really was just dominated by HP. I know there's other companies who made handhelds, Sharp, that kind of thing, but it was mostly HP. So in summer of '91, it was decided to split off the HP products, the 28 and the 48, into a new news group, the comp.sys.hp48 news group. And at the same time, another group was made called comp.sources.hp48. And the difference was that comp.sys was for discussion, comp.sources was a moderated place just for posting programs. A guy by the name of Chris Bell moderated it for a couple of years. After he retired, nobody took it over. There were better ways of getting things then. So, in fact, July 2006, that news group was completely removed from Usenet.
Is there a way back for Usenet?
We'll get to yes, kind of, and I will get to that when I will discuss the USB drive later.
Oops.
So also around that same time, and not everyone even necessarily had internet access, because this was 25 plus 30 years ago almost. BBSs were very popular then, and HP's Corvallis operation, which, as you know, is where the calculators came from, ran the HPCD BBS. People could dial into that, and it provided gateways to comp.sys.hp48, that kind of thing, and had repositories of software. There were other BBSs. One I was able to find reference to is Raiders of the Last Ark from Toronto. There may have been some more, but that one was mentioned in a few locations. Also, for people who may have had access to some things on the internet, but not all protocols, remember this was before the web. This was when Gopher wasn't that popular. Some people only had email, or maybe only had FTP. So there was a guy named Wayne Scott who made a mail server. You'd send an email saying, send me this file, and the mail server would respond back with the file for the calculator. And seq.uncwill.edu, that was an FTP site that kept all of the content sources at HP48 software.
Chu had one.
Oh, okay, yeah. There were also, there are a number of clubs that kept things as well. I'll get to that in a little bit. So, in 1990, the 48 SX came out, and HpCalc with Joe Horn came up with something called the Goodies Disk. And this was a good way for people who had no computer internet network connection whatsoever, pay $5 and you get a floppy disk full of all the things that Joe felt were the best goodies for the calculator. If you look at this, very first goodies disk was 989,000 bytes. The USB drive all of you got has about 29 billion bytes of data on it. So imagine how many goodies disks that would take. Over time, there were 11 goodies disks, with the last one coming out fall of '97. Same time, all these goodies disks were freely available online from the usual sources, the FTP sites, HP, Corvallis, BBS, that kind of thing. It wasn't intended to be a moneymaker, it's just to provide access to the software for people who did not have an internet connection. And as Richard was saying, there were also HP clubs around the world, which were great ways for people in the same geographic area to share software with each other. They had their meetups, their newsletters, that kind of things. And there weren't necessarily communication between the different groups, especially in different countries. There may be one in France that wouldn't necessarily be talking to ones in the U.S., the language barrier, that kind of thing. But yeah.
You know how we shared 41 software?
Oh.
By EEPROM.
Oh, wow.
We would burn EEPROMs and mail EEPROMs to each other.
Right. And then there's sometimes users who spoke multiple languages. I think Doug Cannon was one of the ones who was actually with French groups and American ones, and he was able to bring things from Europe into the English-speaking world. A few FTP sites as well. I mentioned the Corvallis one, and that was very well organized, had a good folder structure, something like maybe close to 1,000 files on it. And the way they organized things was the inspiration for my website's organization. If you remember how it was organized, the folder structure was pretty similar. I added some folders, removed some, that kind of thing, but followed the same basic pattern. Another big one was the cbs.cis.com. I don't remember what CIS was. It was some kind of unaffiliated company that just happened to have an open, I don't think it was, well, maybe if it was CompuServe, but it's not them now. Someone else has a domain name now.
I think it might have been CompuServe.
It may have been CompuServe.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, so CompuServe, a big online provider at the time, they had one large folder that was an uploads folder. Anybody could upload anything in there. It wasn't organized. There was stuff duplicated, misnamed, but there was a lot of stuff there, hundreds of files for the 48. Finally, another prominent one was WashU, wuarchive.wistl.edu. They had something kind of in between the two. It wasn't as well organized as the HP one, but I think it was maybe a little bit less curated, kind of like the CIS one. I'm not sure. Those three were all available about the time I started getting into things. Finally, another source for it in the later years, later meaning like 95, 97, that time period, were many just small individual websites run by various people. Many of them, in fact, I would say almost all of them are lost to time, at least somewhat. I have a bookmarked list from 97 of the HP Calculator websites. There may be, I don't know, 50, 100 on there. Every single one of them does not work except for HP Museum. I think it's the only one in the whole list that works, and a couple of them have new locations, but the vast majority completely gone. But as was mentioned earlier, the Internet Archive organization created something called the Wayback Machine, and you can look in there and you can find some of them on there. If you know the old URLs and look, you can get to some of these websites partially. Most of them didn't have more than a few dozen files in each one, and they had different focuses. Like I know there's one for HP28 programs. There are several that were dedicated to games. Many were just software authors, individual sites. They put their programs on, and that was it. But no real organization. You had to know them, find links to them. Here are some examples. This is Mick Heiskanen. He was a very prominent developer for the 48 and mid-90s. Jazz, LG48, that kind of thing. Here's what his page looked like. Here's another one, game site. One page for cars, planes, and fast things with tunnel. I think Cyril may have written that, Driving Fear, all sorts of random games. Here's another one, Doug Cannon's HP48 page with some of the programs he wrote. Finally, Casey's AIMU48 graphics page. Here he had skins and scripts for using with the AIMU48 engine. So this is what the state of HP48 software availability on the internet was before I launched my website. So where did I come in? I got my first calculator, a 48G, in 95. Got a GX a year later. And spring of 97, I was looking at, there were a couple programs I had come across before on FTP or those web pages, wasn't sure which. And I didn't have that much memory, so I had to delete and reinstall, and I lost them and wanted to find them again. And I just couldn't find them. So I figured what I just need to do is go to every single source of software and download every single thing that they have. And I did that. Then I decided I need to start categorizing them and removing the duplicates to be able to figure out what's what. I started doing this and realized, well, maybe other people could benefit from this too. I was initially just doing it for myself, but then realized it's a lot of effort I'm going into. Maybe others can benefit. Well, at the time, I was running my school district's website, web server, that kind of thing. This was between junior high and high school. And I had access to a server then. I had some HTML knowledge. And I thought, well, I could maybe take advantage of that, so I got permission from the school district that I could host a website related to calculators if I needed to. That time I had about 50 megabytes of data, which was a lot of data back then. I think GeoCities was around then, maybe gave you a megabyte or 2 megabytes or something like that. And there are other providers too, but none offered much space. So what I did is I packaged up everything into a zip file. If it didn't have documentation, I'd maybe add like a 1 or 2 liner just to try and describe it as best as I could. There was a domain name provider, Monolith Internet Services, that provide free domains on ml.org. So I got hp48.ml.org. That was my first URL. And then on August 21st of '97, I announced to comp.sys.hp48 the launch of my website. At that time, it was about 1,500 files. 2/3 of them were categorized with descriptions. The remaining third were just unsorted that took me another half year or so to get through. Here was my announcement. There you can see it, 2:37 in the afternoon Central Time on August 21st, 1997. Attempted to post it to comp.source.hp48, not realizing at that time it was a moderated group with no moderator, so it never showed up there. But comp.sys saw it. That was the announcement. Here's what the site looked like back in '97. Yes.
I should comment that at the time, people were wondering, who's Eric, who's this kid,
Just
you
some
know,
random
it won't
person.
amount to anything.
So it was just for the 48 back then. These were the categories. Again, you'll see they're pretty much the same categories as today. Haven't changed much in that regard yet, but that was 20 years ago. Here's example categories, symbolic math applications showing, just listing them. You can download them, file size, and how big it is on your calculator, which back then meant something. Now with the Prime, who cares how big it is? You've got so much memory. But when you had a 32 kilobyte 48G or 48S, you had a 24 kilobyte program, nothing else is going to fit on there. So a year later, ML.org provider was no longer offering domain names. So I needed to buy my own domain. And I considered a few things. hp48.org was one I was first thinking about. And I was talking to Jean-Yves at the time, and he said, well, maybe it shouldn't just be specific to the 48. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. So I decided to buy hpcalc.org, which was, I will admit that it was inspired by the then existing ticalc.org. So I launched it with the new URL and a slightly revised layout on its first anniversary, August 21st of '98. At this time, I was doing everything, all the coding was by hand. I was using Notepad to maintain everything. I spent thousands of hours the first few years just
Now, is this
putting
while
everything
you were
out
at
there.
school, at college?
I was in high school.
Okay.
So this is still high school for me.
Yeah.
I'd say each program was taking me about 15 minutes to add because I'd have to write all the code and then go to the what's new page and link that in. It just, anyway, okay. I'd say I was spending 3 hours a day trying to get everything caught up on that site. And by '99, I was up to 3,000 files. Well, summer of 2000, that was between high school and college. I taught myself some basic PHP and some very limited SQL. I didn't know much about databases back then, but just enough to be dangerous. So I made a database-driven backend to automate the functionality of the website. I think it was HHC 2005, 2004. I gave a presentation showing how I maintain the site, and it's basically the same today as it was then. But I relaunched the website in August 2000. So, also at the same time, I started college at Rice University, and I contacted them and said, hey, I'd like to be able to continue running my website from my dorm room, and it gets around close to 100 gigabytes a month of traffic. And they said, oh, sure, that's no problem. You can do that. That's great. So did that, and I had the server. It was just an old Linux machine. It was my old computer that I wiped and installed Linux on. That ran the server for my freshman year. 2001, I added user accounts, the ability to comment on programs, vote about programs. Well, 2001, Rice decided that I wasn't joking. I really was getting 100 gigabytes a month of traffic, which was a lot back in 2001. So they said I couldn't do that anymore. So that led to a couple years of me not really having a home. There were there were several people who were able to help share hosting. I had some round-robin DNS to share the bandwidth, and still I was incurring some bandwidth costs. I think 1 month it actually was over $1,000. Thankfully, I put a plea out for donations, and thankfully a number of people, including some of you, came through and donated just to keep the site up. And that's how it was for about 2 years until 2003. University of North Carolina, maybe some of you remember from the 90s, sunsite.unc.edu, that became iBiblio. And they were willing, they agreed to help host my site. So my site moved on to iBiblio in 2003. Well, can't complain too much because it was free, but as time went on, UNC seemed to be caring less and less about iBiblio, and it was getting difficult. They changed things on their server, not tell anyone. I couldn't make changes for sometimes months at a time. So last year, I decided enough was enough. I'm going back to hosting it myself. And for better or for worse, the traffic to my site has not really increased since the early 2000s. Even though the rest of the internet has, the technology is advanced, meaning now it's affordable for me to host it myself. You guys aren't downloading enough, or aren't playing with your calculators enough, apparently. So I have 2 virtual servers that I'm running on Linode, and they're identical. One's primary, one's backup. The backup server does nothing. It's just a clone of the primary one. So, and I manually synchronize them, so if something goes wrong on one, it's not automatically pushed over to the other. So if anything happened to the main server, I would just switch DNS and the site would keep running. But also, this past year, I realized I neglected the site too much for too many years. In some ways, I felt it was holding back the community, that maybe I wasn't providing things as timely as I could, so I decided to do some major improvements. At the same time, I didn't want to change the appearance of anything too much. Oh, I hate change, and clearly you guys hate change also. So I didn't want to make anything too apparent, just a little bit at a time. I guess like the frog being boiled, doesn't really notice if you change things a little bit at a time. And the last year, I've spent more time working on my website than I'd say close to the past decade, the previous decade put together. What are some of the things I did? First, some behind-the-scenes stuff. This may bore some of you, but you can just ignore this slide. But I updated the code to work with PHP 7, so I'm using modern software to keep up with security updates on. I kind of did a security audit looking through things. That one other person did point out a cross-site scripting issue potential that was on the site. I fixed that. I found a potential SQL injection issue, fixed that. Another thing that was kind of interesting is websites on the internet are constantly under attack. Just 24 hours a day, they're under attack. And one thing is attempts to log in by SSH. And they would never be able to get in anyway because the way my server's set up, the logins wouldn't work. But that doesn't stop them. Thousands and thousands of times a day, they're trying to log into the server.
Well, and that's because it's all script kiddies. It's not people. It's not people typing on a keyboard.
Exactly. It's IP addresses mostly from China, and they're just brute force attacks. And they're putting a fair amount of load on the server. It was a measurable amount of load on the server. I set up something called fail to ban. After a few failed attempts, it just blocks their IP for 24 hours. That helped a lot. Another thing I noticed, I don't run WordPress, but WordPress is a very common framework for websites on the internet. And because it's common, there are a lot of people with old versions with vulnerabilities. So you're always seeing these attempted attacks on WordPress. So I've got it set up if they try to access these WordPress URLs, it sends zip bombs. A zip bomb is a 2 gigabyte file that is zipped down to 2 megabytes. So if they're gzip, so if their client, as most HTTP clients are doing, are automatically decompressing gzip stuff, they get a 2 gigabyte file every time they try to attack it. Even though it only uses 2 megabytes of my bandwidth. I also created a dashboard to monitor all user activity. Now, I'll admit there really isn't that much anymore. I'm watching account creations, comments, and votes. Well, I get a few people adding an account a day, maybe 1 vote a day on a program. I'd say once a week does anyone write a comment on a program. So they're not that commonly used anymore. Another thing I did just to improve searchability and stuff like that, I made a new data model for keeping comments in the votes. Nobody would notice it, but it became useful for some other things. Usability improvements. One thing I've always believed in is URLs should be short, easy to type in, easy to remember, and never change.
Those are already taken.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's the famous website, webpage on w3.org or whatever that says, I can't remember, it's a very famous quote, I can't remember, it's something like URLs should be short, fast, short and never change or something. But anyway, I got rid of the technical .php ID equals, so the URLs are shorter now. Something like a quarter, maybe a third of my users are on mobile devices now, and my website is pretty much unusable from a mobile phone. So I made changes to the main page to use responsive design, meaning as the window becomes narrower, it shifts things around and shows and hides things and stuff like that, just to make it be a lot more usable in mobile. For all the other pages, I made a few tweaks that also made them a lot more usable on mobile devices. Since people weren't really voting or commenting on things, I simplified that a little bit. I still have plans on improving further, but it's a little bit easier to use now than it used to be. On the file contributions page where people submit new software, which doesn't happen much, I'd say maybe once a week does anyone submit anything to me. Everything else that I add is stuff I've come up with on my own. But I improved the user experience on that just to make it a little bit less complicated for them. And another thing I realized, there are websites that have been around forever, and they're pointing to URLs on my website that have actually been broken for like 15 years. So I added redirects so those old links that nobody uses anymore still work. Some aesthetic improvements, as I was saying, I don't want to change too much, but I realized that pretty much every other website out there no longer underlines links. So I got rid of the underlines, and I think it made things more legible, cleaned things up a bit. I also added some faint drop shadows just with CSS to make things stand out a little bit more. Got a few more things in mind I want to do going forward. I haven't had time to do them yet. In part because what I'm going to talk about later was getting the USB drive ready for this conference. Some new features I added. Every file now has download counts, so you can see how many times it's been downloaded. The way I do that is by analyzing log files, and I've saved log files over the years. You can see those are the date ranges going back to 2000 that I have log files for. Missing some time in there, 2001 to 2003 when I didn't really have a good host. And then the later iBiblio years when I stopped being able to find where their log files were and never responded to my inquiries. But now, currently, I'm logging everything myself because I've got my own server. I wrote some scripts in awk and PHP to process all the data. I was incredibly impressed with how fast awk was in text processing. What I have for that is it just takes the whole log file and awk my awk script will return just the programs that were downloaded for the purpose of counting URLs. And then the PHP code then takes each of those file paths, queries the database, and converts it to an ID number, because every file in my database is tracked by an ID number. I also added authors pages. What these authors pages do is, I finished this just before the last conference. You can see for every single software author, everything they wrote, and how they rank in terms of the number of downloads and the number of files they produced compared to other authors. Something else I added recently, the ability to add biographical information about each author. Someone on the museum forum suggested that to me, and he said, you really need to have this, it's important. He sent me one sample biography, and I said, I'll do that if you send me any more. I added it, but he never sent me any more. So there's like one Bernard Priest has a biography, and that's about it. A few more features. I added cross-references between programs, so you can, if you're on one program, you can see the related ones. I still need to fill in a lot of data because that's just a manual process, but I got some in. Some basic multilingual support. Something I noticed is that there is no one geographic region that accounts for a lot of my traffic. It's pretty much evenly 1/3 North America, 1/3 Latin America, 1/3 Europe, and just a little bit in Asia, and almost nothing in Africa. But Latin America is 1/3 of my users. Most of them are speaking Spanish, some speaking Portuguese. It's Brazil and Peru are a couple of big ones. A couple other countries add up too. So they're usually searching for things on the internet in Spanish or Portuguese. So for programs, especially those that were written in those languages, I've tried to add a second description of it in those languages. So when they search for those terms, they'll come up with them. A few hundred programs are done now. It'd be nice if I had more. Long term, it would be nice to have a Spanish or Portuguese version of my website, but my Spanish is not good enough. I don't have any Portuguese
was
No.
gonna ask, how do you do it with an automatic translator?
Yeah, I don't. I don't trust automatic translators because the same thing happens the other direction. People submit stuff to
Yeah, I
me,
know.
they
Yeah.
send it through an automatic English translation. And honestly, I'd rather them send it to me in the original Spanish than with a bad English translation because I could probably figure it out more easily.
But you'll get the same thing if you translate it yourself
Well,
using the same tools.
Yes,
Have you got a
but
friend who-
I have some knowledge of
Ah,
Spanish,
okay.
and I could use multiple tools and try different translations and
Sure.
look at words and do better than just English automatic translation with no context.
Have you,
Kind of hilarious.
have you dealt with any languages other than Spanish and Portuguese?
They aren't a significant fraction of users, and especially there are a good number of people in Germany who use my website too, but the vast majority of them speak English just fine. So it's not a concern for me to have to localize them in another language when they can use English. Yes.
There's a lot of user in France for the HPCalc. There's a lot of books in French that
Yeah.
are never published in English. I have
Exactly.
a big, in my library, a big number of books. And do you have French users?
It's not a very significant fraction anymore. I know there were huge users in the 90s and 48, but I don't see that showing up as statistics.
Eric,
Yeah.
do you pay anybody any money to run your site? I mean,
Yeah, so
The domain
yes,
name?
Linode is my hosting provider. I've been cutting the costs now. Right now, I'm around $500 a year is all it's costing me. So yeah, hosting costs have gone down so much, and the domain names are cheap. I've got several domain names, other than hpcalc.org, but they're like $10 a year, so they're pretty cheap. Yeah, as I said, hosting is around $500 a year for two virtual servers. And as costs go down, I'm sure that number is going to go down in the future too.
Do you get any requests to have information removed? And if you do, how many of those, what percentage of those requests are legitimate?
Almost never. I remember one request in the last 10 years maybe, and it was from some author who said he didn't want his thing up there anymore because he said it was obsolete. And I removed it, but honestly, we're getting to a certain point where it may be worth restoring as it becomes history rather than current events. I don't know.
Eric,
Yes.
when did traffic on the site peak?
I'm not sure because I'm missing all those log files, but I would say probably 2006, 2007, somewhere, maybe 2005, somewhere in that time frame. And it has been on the downward trend. Well, the number of unique visitors has definitely gone down. The amount of bandwidth used is not just because files have gotten bigger. If someone downloads the HP Prime emulator for me, that's like 100 megabytes or something like that. Twice the size of the entire site at launch date.
So that raises the question, since the Prime is presumably on an upward trajectory of do you expect that your site will, over time see increases like that, or are Prime people going somewhere else?
So that's actually a really good question. I've been wondering the same thing because yes, apparently Prime is doing pretty well. We're seeing activity from all over the world. We've seen in the museum forum people from China posting. We're still only finished, and then either several other sites like the TI, some of these formerly just TI only sites mentioning the Prime, some others in other languages doing it, and I've seen a lot of Prime programs contributed to the museum forum, but almost no one's sending anything to me. And I wonder, is it because these people don't know about my website, or I have no idea. It's a good question. Why we're not seeing it? Yes.
Well, in 30 or some plus years that I've been active in the community, the people in education have a different view of the world than the rest of us. And we get very few teachers at our conferences. You get all kinds of static about, well, you're September and it's not the right time. There's a whole long list of reasons why. And so since the primary Prime users are in the education field, I would suggest that if you started something, you would be it, and it wouldn't take long, and you'd be right there.
The thing is, how do you reach them?
Huh?
How do you reach them?
Well, it's like anything else. You gotta have it. It's like, how did I reach somebody? I had one piece of paper, both sides, and a newsletter started.
Mm-hmm.
But Yeah, because it's in their interest to do that, and I think it could be done, but you've got the experience, you've got the resources, you can do it. The only real question in my mind is, are you interested enough yourself?
Yeah, that's a question too.
Well, you probably have more Prime programs than any other
Oh,
single
by
site.
far, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Prime, when I look at download statistics, the Prime is starting to shoot up in the rankings, and it wasn't that long ago that 49 was still dominating, but the Prime is starting to see more traffic than the 49 in a lot of ways now on my site. On a program by program basis, not as an aggregate basis.
Is this your last slide?
No, I've
Oh.
got another dozen or so.
Oh,
So another thing I changed recently was, or not I changed, added, is the ability to distinguish between when I added something to the site and when the thing was actually created, because especially as I'm adding historic stuff from 20 years ago, it shows up as new, and I think it'd be useful to see when something was from. So I started manually populating the data, got about 1% done. I hadn't had time to do more, but I'm going to use formulaic approaches to fill in some of that data too, to try to get that better populated. So here's an example of an author page. Joe Horns shows that he's got 190 files on my site. He's the second most prolific author. Sorry, HP has put more than you have. And you've had almost 800,000 different downloads. Again, the second most downloaded author. And then the list of the programs. So I've also added a couple features that are only available for people who are logged into the site. And it's not because I want people to create the account to log in. After all, it's free. It doesn't mean anything to me. But I do it just so that automated bots don't have these things and put extra load on the server. One of them is the ability to download or view within the browser individual files within each zip file or tarball. So you don't have to download the whole archive. You can just read the documentation, see embedded images or whatever without having to go to the effort of downloading the zip file. Other thing I added, this was a big project for me that I'll go into in a little bit, but the ability to download previous versions of every file on my site. And you can see on the pages there's a list of updated to version X on date whatever, updated to version Y on date whatever. You can click on them and you get that old version. Also added some versions that were never on my website, either because I missed them over the years or because they predated my website. Like if there are 10 versions of release of a program before my website came around and I happen to have them in my archives, I put them all, you can then download and see if you want them. So a little bit more history about when I was making my website originally. I mentioned that I downloaded all this stuff from all these places and I categorized it, but then I had stuff left over. I just dumped it all into a folder. The stuff left over were either versions of the programs that were obsolete because they weren't current at the time, or they're programs I just couldn't figure out. There's no documentation and it didn't make sense to me. I couldn't figure out how to extract it. Maybe it was in some weird archive format that I didn't know anything about then, but now I've been able to figure out after all this has been 20 years. And then whenever I'd update a program on my site, I would take the old version and put it into that folder. Beginning in 2000, it was an automated process. Whenever I updated something on my site, it would just dump the old version into a folder. So I went through all those old files, figure out anything that was related to a previous version, and of the 3,748 updates I've made to programs on my site over the years, I was able to cross-reference 3,726. So very few were missing. Some of those were lost because when I launched the new site, I had a bug that sometimes made it so when I updated a program and it backed up the old version, it would wipe out the last backup I made of it. So I lost maybe a dozen that way. And sometimes people would send me the wrong files. I'd say updated to version whatever, but they sent me the old version again, so it never existed as far as I can tell. So here's an example. When you're logged in, what you see on this program here, these are all the historic versions of it. You can click on any one of those to download it. And then inside the archive, those are all the files. You can just click on each one to download them.
Do you keep those the individual files stored statically for that?
Which part? Oh, so these are all actually extracted on the fly. So no, they're not stored statically. On the USB drives I have it so all those files are in a separate folder, so they're all there and it works. It makes the site significantly larger. For a few cases, I've discovered that with tarballs, to pull an individual file out, it takes proportionally more than a zip file because they're solid archives rather than separately compressed. and if the tarball's over maybe a few megabytes, it starts using more CPU time. So there are about 5 or 6 files in the site where I disabled this because they're too big and they're putting a server load that I thought was unacceptable. So after I mashed up all those historic versions, I discovered that I had quite a few programs left over that somehow never made it onto my site. As I mentioned, some of them I didn't understand 20 years ago. So I added them to my site in June. And that, I guess, saved them from being lost to time. It's entirely possible the only copy of those files left over was on my computer in my backups. So they're there on the internet again. Something else, there's that compilations category on my site. It's deceptively big, and a lot of people ignore it. You see the goodies discs, and you know about those, but there are these other compilations too that I think no one ever looks at. And starting with the goodies discs, in 2008 I got help from a couple of people to ensure that every single program on every goodies disc was separately available for download on my website. But I didn't do that with these other compilations. Like Andre Scroll had archives from Canada, Brazil, France, Italy, and Germany. There are all these discs from clubs that we put together. You can download them from my site, but the individual files were not necessarily separately available. So beginning in June, I went through those. 12 Canadian compilations, 15 Italian discs. You got the 8 German, 7 French, 4 Brazilian. I came up with close to 1,000 programs that had not previously been available for separate download on my site. And it took me about 10 weeks to go through. And from the beginning of June until actually just day before yesterday, I did not miss a day updating my website. I've never had a streak anywhere near that one. Yes.
So just out of curiosity, Eric, of these 1,000 programs that were not available before, are they mostly just kind of more of the same old thing? And you've got your 100th quadratic root solver, or was there any that really stood out? Wow, this is cool. And
it was a mix. There was some quality stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff that wasn't as great, but actually there's still a fair number of files on those disks that are not separately available for download on my site, because still to this day I can't figure out what they are. And also a lot of them were like crib sheets people had made for classes, and I didn't think, like written in Italian or Portuguese or whatever. I didn't want to take the time to figure out. They're all still there in my site in the compilations. I think maybe they're more useful in the historic context of being in those compilations than anything else. But yes, to answer your question, there were some good things. None stick out in my head right now, because Joe did a good job of finding all the true goodies. But there were some that were still decent, that date back. Most of these were from the 1990 to 94 time frame, except for Andre's Canadian ones that were from about 97. So here's the total number of files on my site over time. Beginning August 97, you can see it was pretty steep. Here's when I was just catching up with all the years of stuff. And then now that at this point I was basically caught up, so this is just tapering off the number of new things. You can see the 2008 Goodies Disk to Archives project. You can see the last few months there at the end, but it looks to be more linear now. It's just slowly increasing, but not like it was before. Here's another perhaps interesting chart showing by quarter how old each of the programs are on my site in terms of when I added them. This is in terms of when they were made, so many of the ones you see in those last couple of things were actually made back at this time frame. But it's kind of interesting to see, and again, you can see the bump in 2008 with the Goodies Disk project. The number of files contributed, you can see the gaps, partially because I wasn't updating my website, sometimes because I couldn't because of the difficulties with iBiblio. And also there wasn't that much contributed. As I said, maybe only about once a week does anyone submit anything to me. Other stuff I have to find by looking at the museum forum, looking at other forums out there, or just randomly finding them in my backups or whatever. This might be interesting, showing the distribution of files on my site. 48 still the vast majority, with the 4950 being the next biggest, but the Prime is now significantly bigger than the 3940 series and continuing to grow. So will the Prime get to this size? I doubt it, but well, who knows how much longer. If the Prime's around for a long time, maybe it will. So I did get done with my main goal of going through all that stuff that I had to complete my website before its 20th anniversary on August 21st. And I needed to have something special to celebrate the 20th anniversary of my website, and I didn't miss it.
Is that your photo?
Yes, yes. don't have anything special. It's like a 10-year-old digital camera that I have, but it's got a good lens. So.
Have you tried photoshopping it to suppress the central brightness and see more, the more extended corona?
I have another photo where it's a little better to see some of it, but unfortunately the camera wasn't good enough to be able to get enough dynamic range for that. And also my settings were bright. I wasn't focusing on photographing it. I just took a couple quick snapshots, and otherwise was just appreciating those sounds. Maybe next to 2024, maybe then I'll have equipment set up to do something more impressive.
And you can practice your Spanish down there too.
Well, totality will be in Texas.
Well, no, there's gonna be one in Argentina.
Oh, yeah.
2019.
Right. Well, 2024 is the next one I'll probably go to.
Yeah, we need to have the HHC 2019 in April in Argentina.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Good excuse.
Awesome, man.
Thank you very much.